Good evening, everybody. My name, as you can see, is Stephen Skelton. The initials after my name refer to Master of Wine, which is something I've been since 2003. This it's very kind of Paul to invite. I think it was Paul who invited me, or maybe someone else. I forget now. But anyway, it's very kind of the company to ask me to come and talk about my book, which has just been released. Just to give you a bit of background on myself, I've spent, since about 1974-75, being interested in English wine, so growing grapes in England. And after training in Germany for a couple of years, I started a vineyard in Kent, which today is known as Chapel Down. It wasn't then when I started it. I eventually started it, got it producing, eventually sold it, but Chapel Down then bought it some years after that. But anyway, and since 1979, 1980, I've been making wine I made wine for about 22 years, and then I stopped in around 2000 and became a consultant. And so now I'm a consultant to vineyards all across the south of the UK. Today I think I've had about 3 or 4 people email me. Could you come and look at some land I've got? I've got a walled garden, I want a vineyard. I've got 50 acres, I want a vineyard. You know, that sort of thing comes in all the time. And I mostly try and put them off, to be honest, because they don't really know what they're taking on. But eventually I get to the point where we're planting vineyards. And normally I plant about 3 or 4 vineyards a year. Most of them new ones. Some of my old clients come from more vines, which I sell. I import vines from overseas, from France and Germany and Spain, and sell them on, and I get them planted for them and look after the trellising. So I help people get vineyards off the ground and into production. So that's what I do when I'm not doing anything else, writing. I write about wine. Obviously, I've written a few textbooks about wine. This book, which is called The Knight Who Invented Champagne, I think most of the people who are on, judging from the grey locks I can see, will remember the musical from 1958, I think it was, called Gigi, in which there was a song called The Knight, N-I-G-H-T, They Invented Champagne. And I thought it was too good a chance to miss. It would annoy the champenoise as well, which I thought was a good thing. So it's called The Knight Who Invented Champagne, and the knight in question is Sir Kenelm Digby, about whom I will tell you more. So this story about England or Britain having invented sparkling wine before the champenoise really rested on our production, the production in the UK or in Britain of stronger glass bottles than the French. This story was really started in 1998, although it had been known about before, but the story was really started by a very well-known sparkling wine writer called Tom Stevenson, who is the editor of I think it's the Christie's Encyclopedia of Sparkling Wine and Champagne, or Champagne and Sparkling Wine. And he really brought this to the fore because Dr. Merritt, Christopher Merritt, had given a paper to the Royal Society in 1662, in which he talked about adding sugar to wine to make it brisk and sparkling. So that was the sort of genesis of, and this story has been bandied about, and people have got it wrong, and they say Merritt invented the thing. He was merely talking about what was already being done. So I thought that during lockdown I needed something to do, and so I actually started on this book a long while ago, in about 2016, and I put it on one side while I was writing 2 other books. But anyway, I thought lockdown was the ideal time to really get going on this, and so I did. I started it and finished it, and here it is. So you have on the screen, you can see on the left there, that is the knight. He was very friendly with Van Dyck. He had about 6 or 7 portraits of him and his wife painted by Van Dyck, and that is one of them. The bottle in the middle is the type of bottle that we're talking about. Of course, very few bottles remain from this period. 1632 we're talking about, 1630, 1632. Very few bottles remain, but there are a few, and there are some in the UK. There's some, interestingly, in America, because of course this is exactly the time that the pilgrims were going to the United States, taking bottles with them. And it all rests on the question of making a strong bottle. sparkling wine, as you all know, has carbon dioxide under pressure in it. And so in order to trap that and keep that product fresh and sparkling, you have to have a bottle that will withstand the pressure. I'm going to see if I can push this on a bit. There we are. Yeah, so a little history lesson, which puts us in the picture. Though this glass making really depended upon there were a lot of Huguenots who came over during the troubles during the Reformation, and they really got the glass industry off to a start. I mean, there had been a glass industry, but it was very small. But this glass making was one of the things that they brought with them from France, from Lorraine, from the Low Countries. And so at this period, of course, it was just after the reign of Queen Elizabeth. King James, of course, came from Scotland to take over the throne. Our hero Digby was born in 1603, as you can see. We then go, I won't go through all these, but this was a period between during James I and Charles I. This was a period when there were a lot of things changing. This is really the start of the Industrial Revolution, and you'll see why I think it's that. And we take the story through the period of the Commonwealth, the Civil War in England, of course, right through until the period in 1662, when, as I say, this paper was given, and that really. Sir Kenelm Digby was a fascinating character. I mean, his father, Sir Everard Digby, was one of the gunpowder plotters, and one of Kenelm Digby's first memories is sadly of his father being drawn, hung and quartered, drawing through the streets, as you can see there on the left, drawn on a hurdle, facing the road, normally upside down. You were drawn from your prison, the Tower, all the way through London to Tyburn or to St Paul's churchyard, and there you were hung up, and all kinds of unspeakable things were done to you. But Sir Everard, he was a Catholic, and he pleaded guilty out of all the plotters. He pleaded guilty, so he was able to give a speech from the gallows, and he was hung first. So this is one of the first memories of Kenelm Digby. He came from a wealthy family. And he was a bit of an adventurer. At a young age, at 16 and 17, he went on a grand tour. He was in Florence. He was a master swordsman. He went to Madrid during the period that Charles, the then Prince of Wales, was negotiating for the hand of the Infanta. Charles didn't marry the Infanta. He actually went and married the King of France's daughter. Digby was there and befriended Charles, the Prince of Wales, and so they became great friends. And Digby was one of his advisors. He's age 24. He did a remarkable thing. He hired 2 ships. He had very little experience of sailing or of running ships. He took with him a sort of DIY guide to privateering and plundering. And he sailed at the king's, with the king's blessing and the king's permission. He sailed all the way to today's place called Iskenderun to attack the Venetian fleet. And he did that, and he got a lot of booty, and he sailed back. And he came back with treasures, some of which he gave to the king, some of which are in the British Museum. And that really got him off to a flying start. He was knighted. He was made a governor of Trinity House. It is said he was given the monopoly for sealing wax in Wales, which may seem a rather strange thing to be given, but apparently it was very, very lucrative. It was one of the things which he was able to make money out, because in those days, of course, all documents had to be sealed with sealing wax. So he came back aged 25, 26, and started out as he joined the Privy Council, and as I say, became one of the king's advisors. He had married a woman called Venetia Digby. You know, she sadly died. She gave birth to 3 children, his 3 children. She already had 2 children from another liaison, said to be with the Earl of Dorset. But she married Digby. He was besotted with her. She was very, very beautiful. You can see the 2 pictures of her on the left there. Sadly, she died. It is said from drinking viper wine. Viper wine was a sort of tonic which people took, made from, it is said, from parts of the viper, not the venom, obviously, from opium and one or two other things, vitamin C or scorbic acid. And it was said it was taken to keep her looking young and beautiful. There was an autopsy. The king's physician, gave her an autopsy after she died. And is not quite sure how she died, but dead she was. On the right there, as soon as she died, and the maid came in the morning and said to Sir Kenelm, your wife, has sadly died in the night. He got in touch with Van Dyck there and then, and he came over and painted a picture of her. And that picture on the right is her actually dead in her bed the day after she died, sort of slightly propped up with one eye sort of almost open, and a rose upon her sheet. And it is said that Digby had that picture by him throughout the rest of his life. And he also had casts of her hands, her feet, and her face taken, which was quite common in those days. But he also had these dotted around his private house and his living room. After this period, he got involved with glassmaking. Now I want to jump now from that period right to 1662. Because this is really the genesis of this story. What happened in 1662 was that a glassmaker called John Colnet, a well-known glassmaker, he applied for and received a patent from the king for making many things out of glass, including glass bottles. This was contested by 4 glassmakers who swore on oath that Colnet had not invented glass bottles, but they had been invented 30 years before by Digby. Now, this was written down. The Attorney General conducted a long and serious investigation, which I've seen. I went to the House of Parliament to see the paperwork there, and was allowed to handle them and take photographs of them, as you can see. Colnet was investigated and asked about this claim, but he offered nothing material in opposition, as it is written down, and so his patent was dismissed. So this is really the only real connection we have between Digby and glass bottles. But it is a claim that I think stands to scrutiny. These 4 people had worked for Digby, and so, as I say, it was given under oath, and so we have to take this as being a true story. Glass, of course, for bottles was rarely used before 1615, 1620. It was too fragile, it was too valuable, it wasn't of a uniform size, it wouldn't travel, it wasn't strong enough, because glass in those days was what we call voweled glass. I mean, I'm sure I'm talking to people who know a lot more about glass than I do, but I've researched this as far as I'm able to. And for bottles, for sparkling wine, you need a very strong bottle. As you can see there, for champagne, for full strength sparkling wine, 5 to 6 bar, that's 2 to 3 times what you have in your car tires. Glass, again, I'm sure all of you know how glass is made from some relatively simple materials which are available. But the problem with glass is that it requires large volumes of fuel and quite large volumes of sand. And in those days, the fuel, before 1615, the fuel was all timber. And glass used enormous quantities of dried timber. The timber had to be cut, it had to be hauled, it had to be stacked, it had to be dried out. And so your average kiln was in the middle of the forest, and as you cut the timber, of course, the timber supply got further and further away from the kiln. So eventually, after a number of years, the distance to the fuel supply would be far too great. And so you would up sticks, move your kiln to another part of the forest where there was plenty of wood, rebuild the kiln, and off you would go again. So these kilns were fairly insubstantial. The foundation, there's very, very few foundation, or virtually no foundations left of kilns from forests. And what happened in 1615 was that that is a sort of reconstruction of a wooden kiln it's actually in Ireland, but you can see it's a fairly simple affair with just one retort where the glass is melted, and it requires, as I say, a huge amount of timber to keep that going. And the glass was produced at, I mean, in terms of glass making, fairly low temperatures. They didn't really have annealing ovens, which of course would add strength to the glass. And the chimneys really, the kilns didn't really have proper chimneys, and so there was no forced draft as you have in many modern kilns. When glass was not, as I say, was not used for, as we use it today, for packaging, for transporting, for selling. It was, the biggest use was in medicine. And urinals were one of the biggest uses of glass, where physicians could see the color of your urine, which was taken as a sign of your health or otherwise. Small bottles were used for lotions and potions and unguents and perfumes and sort of vials of holy oil, but they were all small bottles, all hand blown, obviously, and of not particularly uniform size. So 1615, we have Admiral Mansell. So this was an advisor to the king, to James I, and he really got hold of the glassmaking industry. He persuaded James I on the 23rd of May, which happens to be my birthday, in 1615, to issue a proclamation which really said that nobody could use timber for smelting glass, for smelting iron, which was the other big use of timber for fuel, and that they had to use coal from there on. This didn't happen overnight, but over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, the use of timber really faded out, and coal became the principal fuel for making glass. Mansell had, as well as having the ear of the king, he owned coal mines in Newcastle. He owned colliers, ships that could bring the coal to the kilns. And so the kilns went from being established in the middle of the forest, and I said fairly insubstantial kilns, they went then from being based where the ships could get to them. So on the sides of rivers, on the sides of inland, inlets from the sea. And because they were stationary, as it were, because they could be permanent, the fuel would come to them, and the sand could come to them, and the glass could go out by ship. They were able to build much more substantial kilns, and this really industrialized the making of coal and many other products that needed a fuel source. And so you have much more substantial brick-built kilns with proper foundations, with tall chimneys, with layers, annealing ovens attached, all of which made the glass stronger and started to the industrialization of glass making. Again, I'm sure you know all about glass making and window glass making. One of the earliest uses for that people would notice was for window glass. Window glass was made initially in the crown way, where you spun on that picture on the left, where you spun a disc of glass, which was then cut into panes, sometimes square or rectangular, and sometimes diagonal. Then later they found a better way of making a window glass by making a long cylinder of glass, cutting it down one side, opening it out, so you then had a large piece of flat glass which could be cut into larger panes. They weren't large obviously by modern standards, but they were much larger and flatter and more uniform. You also had carriage glass and mirrors made from this type of cylinder glass, which then the glass had to be ground down to make it completely smooth, particularly for mirrors. So as you can see, kilns were established. That top left picture there is from a book, a French book, in fact, and it's called, the French call it a kiln Anglais, I forget, a verre Anglais, glassworks. So you can see there a tall kiln with the smoke and fumes coming out of the top, which made it much from the point of view of the glass makers, glass blowers, much easier to work. And the kiln at the bottom is the Red House, I think it's called the Red House kiln, near Stourbridge, which is today a glass museum. I haven't been there, but I would like to go there one day when we're allowed to go around about the country. The glassworks that we think Digby was involved in was at Newnham-on-Severn. There was a glassworks there. It did make bottles. Digby was certainly involved with Mansell. Mansell had a glassworks there, and bottles were certainly one of the products that they made. And it is said, although I can find no documentary proof, it is said that Digby and Mansell had worked together on this glassworks, building, it is said, a special sort of flue arrangement which got the glass much hotter and stronger. Plus, they had better annealing ovens for strengthening the glass. And it is said that here it is that these bottles were made. So the bottle started to become more useful and more known. And we've got books which talk about cider particularly being bottled. There was, of course, much more cider making in England than there was wine making. Wine, of course, was at that stage was pretty well all imported. There was a very small domestic production, but not really of any significance. But wine was all imported in barrel, of course. I mean, wine was imported in barrel into the UK for many, many centuries. And the ports of, well, London certainly, Bristol, Leith in Scotland were all great centres of wine importation and wine bottling. And the biggest bottling plant today is still based in Bristol. The biggest bottling plant in the UK is still based in Bristol. So it has a long heritage, and there's a lot of Bristol glass works making bottles which go through all the centuries since 1615 or thereabouts. So the bottle suddenly came from being a very rare object to being one of quite common. It's a sort of a bit like the mobile phone. You know, suddenly, to start with, only 2 or 3 people had them. They were quite a novelty. And then, you know, 30 or 40 years later, we've all got them. And bottles are very much like that. And I was interested to use a Google search engine to find out how many times bottle was used. And you can see in Shakespeare's writing, bottle he mentions really very rarely. I mean, he wrote a million words and died in 1616. He only mentioned wine bottles 12 times, once for beer, and then for other things only sort of 3 or 4 times. You know, 20, 30 years later, Samuel Pepys, who many of you I'm sure will have read some of his diaries, if not all of them, he mentions drink and bottles thousands of times, or hundreds of times. He had his own bottles made. He had his own crest on them. On the 23rd of October in 1663, he said he went to Mr. Rawlinson's at the Mitre, which was a pub, and had some of his bottles filled. So the idea then was that you had your bottles made for you. You had your crest upon them, so people knew they were yours. Your manservant took them to the pub, to the inn, where the wine was dispensed into your bottles. You took them home, and you drank the wine, and then you took your bottles back, had them refilled, and that's the way it worked. So bottles became a bit like decanters, really. So you'd already bought the wine, and it was filled for you, and then you drank it out. And the bottler in a big house, his job was to take in the wine into the cellar, to rack it up, to clear it, to clarify it, to make sure it was sound, and then, as it was required by the inhabitants of the owners of the house, to bottle it up. And the word botelier is where we get the word butler from. So butler really means bottler. So we know that between 1632, around those 2 years, the bottles were being made by Digby, and we know by 1662 or thereabouts, bottles were in general use. Now, the question of sparkling, as I said, to begin with, this is all down to Dr. Christopher Merritt. So the Royal Society was founded in 1660, I think it was, or thereabouts, when Charles II came to the throne after after the Commonwealth, after Cromwell was dead, and the King was invited back, King Charles II. The Royal Society was started. Digby was a founder member. Dr. Christopher Merritt was a founder member. And glass bottles seemed to be quite a subject which they were interested in. They were all interested in wine as well. To start with, the Royal Society met on a weekly basis. They met in Gresham College normally, and they read papers to each other. They were all learned men. I mean, all the great scientists of the day were members. And Dr. Merritt, he read a paper, and he said, as you can see there on the bottom line, our wine coopers of later times used vast quantities of sugar and molasses to all sorts of wine to make them drink brisk and sparkling, and to give them spirit, also to mend their bad tastes, all of which raisins and cute and stum perform. Well, raisins are raisins, so people took to bottling wine, adding either sugar and raisins. Raisins, of course, have yeast on them, will start the re-fermentation. Cute and stum are both. Cute is cooked wine, so it's cooked juice, sorry, so it's like a sort of concentrated grape juice. And stum is, again, is a wine that has been stopped fermentation wine. So both of those were a source of sugar. And so this is the first real mention of the way of making sparkling wine by putting into a bottle of still wine sugar and yeast, or yeast sauce, to make it sparkling, which of course is the method champenoise. I mentioned, some of you will, I think we were talking about the vineyard that the Tattinger Champagne House have an interest in. They own 51% of it. It's outside Canterbury. I own, I think, 0.03% of it. But we have about 50 hectares of vines there. The name of the estate is Estate Domain Evremond. Saint Evremond was this gentleman on the left there, and we've named it after him. Evremond is a figure in French Champagne because he was a champenoise. He came over to Britain in 1661, so just after this, around this period we're talking about. He befriended Charles, and who made him governor of Duck Island. If any of you have walked through St James's Park, at the back entrance opposite the back entrance to number 10, Downing Street, you will see there's a duck house in the middle of the pond. There's usually a pelican or two wandering around. And in those days, that pond or lake in St James's Park was used for duck shooting. And he was made governor of Duck Island. Really, it was a sinecure. He was given £300 a year, which is quite a lot of money. But he moved between the good and the famous, and to these with this Hortense Mancini, who was a woman who I think she needs a biography writing about her on her own, because she was up to all kinds of things. But she had a salon, as they did in those days, at Montague House, which was where the British Museum is now. And this Charles St Evremond, he introduced champagne. Now, champagne in those days was not sparkling. It was still wine that came in barrel from France, down the rivers, down the Seine, across the Channel, into the Thames, and was sold. And what happened was that quite a few people decided that actually they preferred sparkling champagne, and so they started adding sugar to wine, as I've just explained. And that is really where the taste for sparkling champagne came. The French didn't like sparkling champagne. They liked the still champagne, and they had done for many years. But the British taste was for sparkling champagne. So with our stronger bottles, which the French couldn't produce, they didn't, because they were still using wood. They had a lot more forest than we do, and still do. And of course, they didn't have the coal supply that we do either. The coal in France is a very, very long way from anywhere, really. It's all along the eastern seaboard, eastern border of France. And so transporting it, of course, was very difficult. So they continued to use wood for smelting until about 1715, about a century after we did in Britain. But Evremond was quite a bright character in his day, and as I say, he introduced champagne to the British nobility, and he's buried in Poets' Corner as one of the I think the only foreign-born poet or a person to be buried in Poets' Corner. There's a plaque on the floor. So the book ends with a look at the production of champagne, and I won't go into it in huge detail, but as you can see, the sort of first real mentions were around the 1709, as I say, 1735, the king, there was a decree about the bottle size. This picture, the déjeuner de huître, the oyster lunch, is famous for showing a bottle of champagne with the cork flying out. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but if you look here in that serving man in the blue in the middle, above him there is a cork. If you look on the right-hand picture, you can see it quite clearly up the top there. And this was a bit of a novelty, really, a bottle of champagne where the cork flew out, you know, fully a yard or more, a meter or more above the table. And it was really a sort of a party piece to have a bottle of champagne that you let the cork fly. The famous champagne houses were all formed during this time. This, remember, is a century after we were making sparkling wine and cider in Great Britain. The first sale of champagne, we don't know whether this was sparkling or not. The first sale of champagne in bottle was 1744. Up until then, champagne was all sold in barrels. So champagne, if you think about it, was the first wine that left the producer in the bottle that it arrived at for the consumer. Up until every other wine, and for many years afterwards, every other wine was sent in barrel and was bottled at where it was going to be consumed. But champagne, because it was sparkling, because it had to be produced under special circumstances with the right type of bottle, the right type of cork, all the corks had to be wired on, as I say, was the first wine that actually left the producer and arrived at the consumers in the same bottle. This is why champagne branding is so strong, because it was the first wine that could be branded. Up until then, you know, if you bought wine, it would be Mr. So-and-so's best blend, and who knows what sort of blend it was. So it was blended by the sort of vintners of the day. Right. That's really the extent of my talk. And Paul, how are we doing for time?
We're all right for time. It'd be nice if you could take your screen sharing off.
Yeah, I could do that, I think. Do that. Stop share. There we are.
That's right. And then we can see if anybody's got any questions.
So I just before I finish, there's the book. My book had a very nice review in Jancis Robinson's her website the other day, and so I've been selling over the weekend. I think I sold 12 books. And if anybody would like a copy, I've got two versions. I've got the full color version where I had 150 printed, and I'm selling them one by one. I've got about 50 left, I think. Or you can buy it on Kindle, on Amazon. The photographs are in black and white, the colors cover, and it's available as an ebook as well as a Kindle book. So it's available in 3 different ways. Paul, yes.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that all this.
Now, you've got a copy, haven't you?
I have indeed. Yes.
Yes.
Signed, in fact.
Anybody can have a signed copy.
Yes, I do. I think
the
it's
unsigned ones are more valuable probably because there are fewer of them. But
I think it's fascinating actually that all this was going on before the glass sellers got their royal charter in 1664. So clearly the glass industry was evolving in quite a big way. I hadn't realised that it was so far down towards the West Country. As you've pointed out and done the research, I wondered if
there was access to the sea. You know, the canals.
Yes.
Canals weren't built. There were no real canals until a bit later.
Yeah. So I think
canals, of course, you could take coal pretty much anywhere in the country.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons it sort of gravitated to the Midlands was because the clay was available.
That's one of the reasons. Yes, clay was as important as the coal, to be honest.
But the coal they could transport quite easily, whereas the clay was a bit more, was heavier and more difficult.
Well, so you didn't need so much clay.
Yeah.
But the clay, In fact, in some coal mines, the clay, the pot clay, was more valuable than the coal.
Wow.
Apparently, they would come across seams of it. Apparently.
Paul, may I ask a question?
Yes, of course you can, Stephen.
One of the I'm a great fan of Sir Robert Mansell. Did a paper for the glass sellers as a Ravenscroft lecture a couple of years ago. But one of the most important things in this is that Sir Robert Mansell, who, as Stephen said, owned vast coal mines, persuaded James I to give him a monopoly and to ban the use of wood. And there's a wonderful quote by James I, who I believe had quite a good sense of dry sense of humour. And in granting the monopoly, he said, "We do marvel that someone who's gained so much fame on the water should now meddle with fire," on learning that Mansell, who was an admiral at the age of 24, was getting involved in glassmaking. But the most crucial thing is that, as a glassmaker myself, we've done experiments and discovered this. When you burn the ingredients for glass, and particularly the sand, which needs over 2,000 degrees, with wood, you can't get a temperature much above 1,100 degrees. Whereas if you use coal, and later obviously gas, you can get up to 1,500 degrees, and it melts the sand much quicker. And of course, in order to control the extra heat, these vast cones were built. It's interesting to note that in France, where there was a rival glass industry, they don't have those glass cones because most of they were allowed to burn wood until about the 1820s. And so they didn't need it. But this was the reason, in fact, the glass was so much stronger, it was melted at a much higher temperature, and it could withstand the pressure of the gases. And without Sir Robert Mansell's monopoly and development of coal instead of timber, I don't think Sir Kenelm Digby could have discovered the use of bottles for sparkling wine. So I think it's an important cog in the development. I've no doubt Sir Kenelm Digby was the person who encouraged and perhaps invented, inverted commas, or developed it. But Sir Robert Mansell played a very important role in that development, I think.
Mansell was indeed very, very important, and
Yes.
he's a central figure to this. It is really his life story is really what this is all about, because he was involved with so many different factories and glassworks.
He owned 24 glass factories once, did more glass factories than anybody else in history in the United Kingdom.
One of the things I didn't realise was that cullet, broken glass, was an important part of the mixture.
Yes.
As it is today. And one of the reasons why you don't find fragments of broken glass is because they had a value. Exactly. Whereas in pottery, of course, pottery works are littered with fragments of broken pottery because they make excellent hardcore. But glass had a value. The glass was, assiduously collected up and sold to the glassworks.
Indeed.
The beginning of recycling.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's one of the unique selling parts that glass, once it's made, it goes on in perpetuity.
Can I also, a secondary question, can I also ask Stephen about Dom Perignon, who is supposed to have invented sparkling champagne? I'm a great fan of Ruinart, the house that's a bit older than Moët Chandon. And they also had a monk who developed champagne. And I'm not quite certain why Dom Perignon is the one who's credited with it, or whether, as a vintner, Stephen, I wonder whether you can throw some light on how the sparkling process was developed by the monks.
Well, it wasn't really.
Right.
The last chapter is all about champagne and includes quite a long chapter on Dom Perignon. Dom Perignon was the fact that the idea that he had invented sparkling wine was a complete fabrication of Moët Chandon's.
Right.
In the 1920s.
Right.
What he was credited with and is credited with, and it's written about quite a lot, is selecting grapes of different types and keeping them separate, so he could tell you that, he knew the different qualities. Initially, all vineyards were planted what we call en foule, which means there was no wire, of course, in those days. So each vine had its own stake. They were all very close planted, maybe only a foot, 18 inches apart from each other. The grapes were very often sort of lying on the ground, so terrible condition. There were no pesticides, no fungicides. Red and white grapes or black and white grapes were all grown together in the same field. And so wine, it wasn't really red wine, it wasn't really white wine, it was a sort of grey, I'm talking about Champagne now. It was a sort of what we call partridge eye colour, a sort of light tawny rosé. But what Dom Perignon seems to have done is to make sure that the grapes were picked separately, so he could get the grapes at the perfection of ripeness, to make sure they were picked whole sound bunches, were pressed so that the juice from the black grapes ran pure white, pure clear. And of course, that is the practice that is done in Champagne today. So a whole bunch pressed, no colour was allowed to run out of the black grapes, and they were then blended with the other varieties. So he really started the idea of separate varieties, separate picking dates, more care over all kinds of things of blending. But wine in his day was still, the Champagne was still, it wasn't sparkling. And it wasn't sparkling. He died in, I think, 1715. So he died just sort of when sparkling Champagne was becoming a thing in France. And but during his lifetime, Champagne was not sparkling.
Yes. Is it also true that in fact the English were actually bottling cider in those bottles before Champagne, because they're down near, not far from Somerset and the West Country, where cider was much drunk. But of course, the aristocrats didn't. It was the common people who drunk cider. Some of it still, but some of it sparkling. And I always believe the early bottles that were made were used for cider rather than champagne.
Well, they were, yes. I mean, we have there's in fact the Royal Society, before the paper I talked about by Christopher Merritt, there was one in the previous week had been read by, I think it was Reverend Beale, about doing exactly that with cider. And as you're correct. I mean, cider could be made from could be made from apples, is made from apples. But apples can last for 4 months, 5 months maybe. So you can make cider for a very long time. Whereas grapes, of course, you can only make it once in the year. Wine, sorry, you can only make once once the grapes are picked. You have to make the wine. I mean, it doesn't last without proper salting, without proper hygiene. The wine wouldn't really last that long. By sort of the beginning of the spring, sort of May or so, wine from the previous year was probably undrinkable. Whereas cider, you could carry on making cider for quite a long period of time. And yes, I mean, cider making was much, much bigger than wine making in the UK, obviously. And much more the drink of the common person.
I also heard that Moët ordered some bottles from Newcastle, amongst some of the earliest bottles that they put the sparkling wine in, because obviously their bottles
I haven't investigated that, because I wanted to go and look at the London port books, right, because apparently they are shown in 1634, I think it is, as being bottles, English bottles, verre Anglais, as being export goods. And there are records which you can go and see, but unfortunately I couldn't do it because of the lockdown.
Yeah.
But I would like to there's quite a bit of research I would have liked to have done, but unfortunately I wasn't able to.
I'm trying to dig out my source for that. I think it's probably Turner's book on the glass.
Well, certainly we were exporting bottles.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Yeah, all over Europe.
Yes, but I think they were made in Mansell's factory also in Newcastle as well.
Well, he did have substantial glassworks in Newcastle.
Thank you.
He lost a lot of money when the Scots invaded Newcastle and claimed it as theirs, and unfortunately they got hold of one of his glassworks, and he had to sort of buy it back from them.
I was delighted to see your portrait of him, because there was no known portrait, and I couldn't believe it when I wanted to do my talk. And I traced his family tree to Wales, and I wrote to the owner of the house, and he said, yes, I've got a portrait of him on the wall. Would you like a copy? And he sent me a copy, and it's now in Wikipedia. I was supposed not to keep it to myself, but David Watts took it. It's now in Wikipedia and everything. And
I don't know which
enough,
one. I think I've got a picture of him, but I don't know where that came from.
Yes, well, it's certainly on Wikipedia, but it comes from his home in Wales.
Right.
And Methuen Campbell, was it? Thomas Methuen Campbell, who allowed me permission to reproduce it. And funnily enough, we look alike. We have a big beard and a large people, and so I'm a great fan of Robert Mansell. It's a similarity.
I did have some trouble. I mean, some of the pictures I wanted, I couldn't afford to use. I already had to pay for about 4 of them, which cost me a lot of money.
I think it's beautifully illustrated. I'd love a copy. Through Paul, I'll try and, if I can get the signed one, even better.
Paul, you've got my email address, haven't you?
I have, and in fact, I sent out the details of buying the book a few weeks ago.
Right.
If you email me, Stephen, I'll certainly give you.
Thank you. I've got quite a large cellar and large library of wine books too, so I'd love to add that to it. Thank you. I'll shut up now.
You can't see I'm sitting in my office where I've got all my wine books behind me.
Please God.
1660 is my earliest.
Wow.
Viticulture.
Fantastic.
Stephen, could I ask a quick question? You showed us the founding dates of 4 major champagne houses.
Yeah.
Were they founded to start producing sparkling wine, or were they producing still champagne when
they were producing still wine?
Ruinart,
is the oldest, I believe.
Yeah.
And I've got it in the book, so don't. I think no, they started when they started as still wine houses.
Oh right.
I mean, the Champagne region was famous for its wines from the Middle Ages. I mean, all the kings of what we call France were crowned there, and the wine from there had this sort of royal stamp of quality on it. It was, of course, the nearest. Well, it still is the nearest wine growing region to Paris, and so with transport being what it was, and you've got the rivers, there's the Meuse, and there's 2 or 3 other rivers which feed into the Seine. So getting wine from Champagne to Paris was relatively easy down the rivers, and so that's why it was always revered as being an important wine growing region, more so than Burgundy. I mean, as soon as the railways arrived, then all wine could come up from Burgundy, and the acreage of there was huge vineyards all around Paris until the railways came, until the sort of early 1800s, 18 or 1850s, I think it was, and then of course wine could come from pretty well anywhere.
I think Richard wants to ask a question.
Thank you. Yes, I've been very polite and listening with great interest. First of all, Stephen, fascinating history, and the other likewise. 2 Stephens. Current scenario. A great friend of mine mass produces what are called vine shelters for the protection of newly planted vines.
Yeah.
The first 2 or 3 years. Not everybody planting vines chooses to use the protection. Fends off rabbits, but also has a microclimate apparently. Is this something that you would recommend to your clients?
Well, I think most people do use vine shelters, I would say.
Yes, I think that's from my understanding, but I know
they haven't. I mean, I'm not a fan of them, to be honest, because I don't like the greenhouse effect. I think it's detrimental in some cases. It depends very much on the type of guard you use. There are literally, though. I mean, I could find 100 different manufacturers of guards.
Sorry.
Well, there are lots and lots of them. I mean, in the UK, we use Tubex, is one of the big companies who make them. But I import mine from France, to be honest. I find the ones that they make are better. They're better ventilated.
Well, my pal mass produces and exports the majority to France. So I wonder whether they're all coming back.
Oh no, these are made in. I've been to the factory where these are made. But Yeah, I mean, it's quite possible. It's a big,
It's a big
if
demand.
you think about the vineyards of the world, every vineyard has to be replanted in every 35 or 40 years. So a 40th of all vineyards are being replanted at any one time. That is many, many, many millions of vines, and other plants as well, other hardwood plants that require guarding against rabbits. I prefer rabbit fencing, which goes around the outside. You have to dig.
And keeps the deer out as well.
Sorry?
And keeps the deer out as well.
No, well, you need deer fencing for that. It's rabbit fencing, deer fencing, and badger fencing.
Yeah.
Depending on whether you've got any of those or all of those, you need to have the right. Deer fencing needs to be at least 2 meters high.
But most of the recently planted vineyards in the southeast, at least, which I've seen, have got deer fencing around them now.
Yes, not most. I think there's some. I mean, probably about 50%. But people don't like it because it looks ugly and it's expensive. But culling, I mean, deer don't eat the grapes, so it's only really if you can keep them off the first few years, then they're fine. I mean, most people.
I thought I must connect you with my pal who'd love to talk to you about it.
What's the name of his guards or his company?
Rainbow.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
It made in Brighton.
Yeah, I know Rainbow. Yeah.
Well, don't say anything nasty in public about them.
All right. I don't know that anybody uses his guards though, but there we are.
Well, he does quite well out of it. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Always pleased to hear of new suppliers.
Thank you for your advice. I'll connect you to him via Paul.
Okay.
Stephen, thank you. I think the time has come to wrap up proceedings. Thank you so much for sparing the time from your clearly busy life to come and give us such a fascinating talk about the history of glass wine bottles with such a range of colourful characters en route. I mean, they really did seem to lead full and varied lives, but a fascinating history. You've expanded our knowledge even further about various aspects of glass, and we're most grateful to you, and thank you.
Well, I'm very
for sparing the time.
I'm sorry we didn't have a few more people, but there we are. You've been lucky.
Disappointing. Well, I suppose there were two factors. One is we normally have done these talks on a Thursday when we couldn't this time, and the other was, of course, some little football match that seemed to be on.
But I'm pleased that we won the football match. That was good.
Yes, but we select few owe you a big debt of gratitude. Thank you.
No, well, thank you very much. It was good. It was good to do it.
Yes,
and are you a member of the Vintners?
Sorry?
Company? Are you liveryman of the Vintners Company?
I am actually, yes. I joined in February 2020, and I've been paying my subscription and never been to an event.
Oh, right. We had a dinner there last week.
Indeed.
Right.
Very good one. Very successful.
Excellent. Well, I think on that note, I have recorded it, so we'll edit it and we'll make it available on social media and send you a copy as well, Stephen.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul.
Very, very informative and very useful. I'm disappointed we didn't do more, but it will go out to the various glass societies, so they will all have an opportunity to have a look at it and look at the history with an opportunity of buying the book as well. So
I'll send you a copy of the review that I got, which is quite...
Okay, that'd be lovely.
Myself is quite glowing.
Excellent. It'd be very good.
Okay.
Okay, now for everybody to know, we're going down now to not quite so often gatherings, and our next one is going to be a presentation by Andy McConnell around the 15th of July, and I'll send out the newsletter accordingly to do with that. He's going to be talking about wine and the use of glasses for wine. I wish you all a very good week. Enjoy.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night, Stephen.
Thank you, Stephen.
Good night.
Thank you,
Stephen. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.